Morning, everyone. Great to welcome you. I want to welcome those watching online as well. So grateful for Matt last week. If you didn't get a chance to listen to that message, I hope you will. Really an exceptional one, and spoke to my heart, and I trust it will yours as well. Today we return back to the Gospel of Mark. We are in the final stages, quite literally, as we're following Jesus to fulfill the purpose for which he came. So when Matt was talking about, he's giving a little insider baseball on how pastors think about weddings and funerals, and I have found this across the board. It's always difficult because the joy, sometimes the sentimentality, and I am as sentimental as they come. I cry easily. I love all that stuff. When it's Christmas and all the colors are there and everything's bright and cheery and everybody hopefully is off work a couple of days and with their family and friends, it's really hard to find ways, as I think about this as a pastor, wow, how do we take his birth and connect it to the purpose for which he came, which is not sweet and easy and poster worthy, right? And that's really where we find ourselves, I think, as Matt wisely said, going into Easter. There's such a celebration coming, but first, the road that we follow, if we're following Jesus, is hard and dark and tough. And when I was preaching 2 weeks ago, we just saw Jesus before Pilate, the Roman governor of that Judean region, who has basically finished his time with Jesus. And we pick up right where that left off today, and we'll see the purpose for which he was born. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. Just really quickly, this, scholars tell us, is the Praetorium. It's the governor's official residence in Jerusalem. Pilate normally lived outside of Jerusalem. From what we know, he wasn't a big fan of going in and generally saved going into Jerusalem for the high holidays when crowd control was an issue, likely located in Herod's palace. The whole battalion, that's a large group, is about 600 Roman soldiers that are dispatched to basically oversee the sentencing of death over one man, Jesus, who doesn't seem like much of a threat, but you get a sense just by this decision, the volatile nature of what's happening here. And that Pilate is worried that there could be a crowd control issue. These were auxiliary troops assigned to the military governor, and they had accompanied Pilate from Caesarea for the Passover feast, and now they're going to have a hand in what comes next. Let's see what happens. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews." Apparently, in this march to Jesus' final destination, which we'll see in a moment, Golgotha, just outside of the city of Jerusalem, these soldiers decide to pass the time with a little entertainment. And the entertainment is that Jesus will be dressed up, as it were, in mockery, purple robe, the color of royalty, as a king. They're going to twist together a crown of thorns, place it on his head. I'll say more about that in a moment. And they're going to hail him King of the Jews. Obviously, none of these guards believes this is who Jesus actually is, but let's have a little fun while we've got this duty that has been dispatched to us. In his commentary, William Lane writes, the so-called crown of thorns was not meant primarily as a torture, but was part of the mock royal attire, like the robe. It may well have been an improvised caricature of what's called the radiate crown, signifying divine kingship, and frequently depicted on coins then in circulation. So you can Google search these coins. I'll bring up just two examples of to the Emperor Tiberius, and you'll notice, do you see that laurel wreath? That is called the radiate crown. That was used specifically for divine homage coinage. Not all coinage in the Roman Empire has this symbol, but this one does because Caesar is to be worshiped as a god. So it's very possible that some of these soldiers have caught wind that this man claims to be the Son of God or has some close relationship to God, and let's put this radiant crown of our own on him, adding to the mockery. It's really a chilling picture when you think about it. And to show, if there's any doubt that there's not an ounce of sincerity among these soldiers, I think we see it very clearly in the next verse. And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him, hailing him as King of the Jews, kneeling in homage to him. James Edwards captures the irony well. He says, the soldiers, despite their intention, acknowledge in both word and deed Jesus' true identity, although that's not their goal. Even in rebellion against God, humanity still bears witness to God. What a chilling picture. If this truly is the one and only Son of God, and this is how he's being treated. But I think it's a good point for us to kind of step back and ask ourselves again, is Jesus simply an unfortunate victim kind of caught and crushed between the gears of history? Wrong place, wrong time, and he would rather have not found this to be his fate. And we're reminded, if we study Old Testament prophecy, 700 years before Jesus was born, the prophet Isaiah describes the coming suffering servant in this way. I gave my back to those who strike and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting. Now, one of the things here that I'm fascinated by, and I invite you to consider this as well, is it's so clear. It's spelled out in black and white that the coming Messiah will suffer. But there's other Old Testament passages that say the coming Messiah will triumph. Both are true. We're going to have to see how that orders itself out. And the disciples, his followers, the leaders, have all this information in black and white, their sacred scrolls, and nobody seems to connect the dots. But Jesus knows exactly what he is doing, and he is willingly giving himself over to fulfill this ancient portrait of what Israel's Savior, what their Messiah will do. Let's see how Mark tells the story. He does it rather economically. He doesn't give much detail. He says, and when they mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. And I want you to notice this last sentence. And they led him out to crucify him. That's the first sentence that speaks of the crucifixion as a systematic execution. And notice it's very, very restrained. I didn't expect this note to survive this week, but I just left it in because I couldn't really pretty it up. I'll just tell what I wrote down. No editorializing here. Mark doesn't pause to amplify the grief or the horror. He simply writes, and they led him out to crucify him. The restraint of that sentence is its own kind of weight. Mark is not telling us much about the nature of the crucifixion. Now, fascinatingly, some of you may know, and you can look this up online, in the 80s, I think 1986, if memory serves, a very esteemed scholarly article was written, I think it was in the New England Journal of Medicine, somebody can double check me on that, by two physicians. And they medically chronicled the elements of the crucifixion process. Yes, it's not an easy read. They included pictures, they included where the spikes would go, how the scourging prior to crucifixion worked. It's a fascinating study, but they also overlay their findings with a description of what we get from the Gospels. And one of the remarks they make is, while we get little details about the crucifixion, this is what we know happened. And I want us to consider why. Why so little detail? Because there's details about other things. But the crucifixion is told with great restraint. And we'll come back to that. But first, there's one last thing Mark wants us to see. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. A couple of things here. I'll leave that up for a moment. You rarely see Mark mention two guys, Alexander and Rufus. Why would you mention that? You would typically do that if you assume your audience knows who they are. right? If I were to drop some names, right, of folks in our church, you would say, oh, yeah, I know who he's talking about. And that appears to be what Mark is doing. Most scholars, most ancient historians believe that these two men, Alexander and Rufus, were probably prominent leaders and well-known Christians in the first century church. And it's fascinating, just to linger here for a bit, it appears to be this moment that planted the seed of curiosity in their father, Simon of Cyrene, a man from North Africa, who was there with all the Jewish pilgrims who came in to celebrate the Passover feast. And the last thing he ever counted on was being conscripted into forced servitude and to carry the crossbeam of Jesus on his shoulder. Notice the implication. Mark doesn't tell us, but it's implied. Why? Because he's too weak to carry it. The blood loss he would have suffered from the whipping, the scourging, the sleep deprivation, the blows, the punches, hit with a stick, pushed and shoved, mocked. He can no longer carry that cross. And so they have to get somebody to finish the job, and they just get this near passerby who comes into that moment in history. And if this man, which I hope, put his faith and trust in this man on his way to be crucified, I have a weird list of people I'd love to talk to in the first few weeks of heaven, and he is in my top 5. What was it like on that day to be forced and walk alongside Jesus as he went to do his great redemptive work and carry that crossbeam on your shoulder? What was that like? It's an amazing picture. But it also recalls something Jesus said earlier that Mark records. You probably remember this. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, Jesus said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And they knew exactly what that meant. That identification with me, association with me, and we see that borne out in the historical record, may cost you everything. So I just wrote this down. I'm fascinated by this. Simon of Cyrene becomes the first person to ever fulfill this command, and he does it quite literally. And then Mark tells us in the next verse that they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. Now, you can look that up. Perhaps you've seen that. If you type that in, you do an image search, you'll find various possible sites where that may have been. It would have been right outside the city of Jerusalem. And it probably is a description of the rock outcropping forming what looked dimly somewhat like a skull, a human skull. But that became its kind of known landmark name because this is the place of death, and that's where Jesus finds himself. And we see this little detail in the next verse, and they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. I talk about myrrh as often as I can at Christmas because it's the only time you ever think of it, right? There's gold, the wise men bring, the magi, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold kind of makes sense. It's kind of kingly, right? Frankincense, we don't know what that is, but we hear incense in it and say, okay, that's used in worship. That's interesting. Myrrh is kind of the odd man out in that odd triplicate gift. And it's mentioned only 3 times. This is easy to see in the New Testament. In the nativity story, it's one of the gifts. It's mentioned here as he is about to do his final redemptive work. And we'll see it in a little bit, a few weeks from now. It's one of the spices that the women bring to the tomb in a pre-embalming culture to mitigate the effects of human decay. They bring myrrh. Interesting that those 2 places after the birth of Jesus, it's mentioned in association with his death. Isn't that a strange gift for a baby? But wine mixed with myrrh, we're told by the scholars, is kind of an ancient narcotic, as it were. right? In a day and age without Oxycontin or even ibuprofen or Tylenol, this is about as good as you could get. You would mix some myrrh and wine, and apparently it dulled the edges of sharp pain. But you notice Jesus refuses to take it. William Lane says it well, but he refused it, choosing to endure with full consciousness the sufferings appointed for him. He takes no shortcut, doesn't cheat. He bears the full weight down to its granular details in embracing what never should fall upon him. But he embraces it just the same. And then, verse 24, and again, it's just a phrase in this one. And they crucified him. It doesn't give the details about the hammer and the nails placed through the wrist and his feet. None. Just they crucified him. He gives more attention to this, dividing his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide which each should take. And this is a hard detail. It's never been portrayed, and probably it shouldn't be for obvious reasons, in a film version. But I believe that the weight of biblical evidence is that Jesus, he died naked. Just one more little added detail of shame. He's first in the purple robe, and it seems that the soldiers get the idea as they get closer, we better swap those clothes out. We don't want to get in any trouble with the higher-ups. Put him back in his peasant clothes, of which they would have no interest in for any valuable reason, other than now, right as he's crucified, to strip him once again and play a little game, the way kids would roll the dice. Yeah, take his outer cloak, take his sandals, take whatever they could from him to make a game out of it. Again, this too, notice the detail. Hundreds of years before this happened, Psalm 22, they divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So I want to ask these two questions before we celebrate communion together this morning. And just think through this with you for a moment. Why is the description of the crucifixion so restrained? And a related question, why are there so many more details regarding how Jesus was mocked? You notice that? I mean, I have to go back a couple messages before. The insults, the ridicule, the punches, the blows, the spitting, the crown of thorns, the phony robe. Mark gives us all those details. But the crucifixion itself is told in a very restrained manner. Well, again, commentator Daniel Aiken says, completely alone, humiliated, naked, and beaten nearly to death, our Savior endured yet again ridicule, shame, and pain at the hands of sinful men, at the hands of those he came to save. So here's what I want us to consider this morning before we take communion together. And it's that Jesus didn't bear only our sin. Don't get me wrong. He bore our sin, and we are lost without him doing that. Right? If he doesn't bear our sin away, it's unthinkable. But all these details, the mockery, the ridicule, the nakedness, the insults, the spitting, the punching, what is that about? He also bore our shame. There is a reasonableness, right, to shame when we think of our sin. When we think of the things that we've done or left undone. Why did I do that? What we call our low moments. We come up with euphemisms. We call them mistakes. We call them, not my finest hour, right? We all do that. I do that. I'm famous for that. I love to wordsmith myself. So the reality of my self-serving, self-worshiping sin gets a little softer, right? But it's just defiance. It's cosmic treason. It's clenching my fist and shaking it in God's face and saying, I don't care what you say. I don't care who you are. That's the shame that's associated with my sin. Why is Mark giving us so many details, so many details? Because he is telling us he bears not only our sin, he's made that clear, he also bears the ridicule, the shame, the mockery that our sin deserves. He bears that too. He doesn't want to leave us in the prison house of shame. I know people that are so paralyzed by guilt, so self-imprisoned by their sins and their poor decisions that they feel like they can't do anything. They can't worship, they can't serve, they can't show gratitude. But the whole time we are seeing, don't you understand, my son? Don't you understand, my daughter? I took that shame away. The shameful things done to you, the shameful things that you've done to others, I took that away. It fell upon me. The spitting, the taunts, the mockery, it falls upon me. He takes away our shame. What a great gift of the good news of the gospel. Our shame. He takes that too. I love what the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5. He says, for our sake, he, in the context, that's God the Father, made him, that's God the Son, Jesus, to be sin who knew no sin. Now notice the exchange. Our sin is placed on him, but notice the second part. So that in him we might become the righteousness of God. His innocence, his shameless reputation, his honor falls upon us. It's an incredible reversal. Please don't confine yourself to a prison house of self-condemnation or shame when Jesus is telling us, what are you talking about? I took that for you. I took it from you. And I'm going to take it all the way into the tunnel of death. I'm going to take it to the tomb. It's buried. It's gone. Pastor Jeremy Treat has written this. Jesus was crucified to bear your shame and to adopt you into a family where you share in the King's honor. That's good. Final thought. Jesus was stripped of dignity so we could be clothed in his righteousness. That's what Mark is showing us in this remarkably restrained telling of the crucifixion with incredible detail about the shame that he takes from us.